Hello everyone and welcome to our month of October. And I wanted to do a video the first day of the month this time because I wanted to introduce you to our topic for the month, and I want to do a quick demonstration just to get us into the spirit. Now, the topic that we are going to be covering this month is going to be trees. And you might be thinking, but Karen, I've been a patron for a while. Didn't we already do trees? Guess what? We did do trees, but it was an entire year ago. So I don't know where the time goes, I know. But we did focus on trees a year ago, and we focused a lot on trees, on how to paint the shapes of trees, and we did a little bit on sky holes, and we painted a variety of trees, palm trees and evergreen trees. This time I'm going to do trees because a tree is a really good subject, so that it's a really good subject for me to share with you what I think is one of the most important concepts in painting, and that is edges. And I know you've heard about edges, and you're going to hear a lot more about edges because this month we're going to focus on edges. And then we're also going to have a more in-depth look at sky holes. So last year we kind of touched on it. We're going to go a little bit more in-depth. So the subject will be trees, but the concepts and the ideas that we're going to cover will be, you'll be able to apply them to any subject matter. So if you're like, I don't really want to paint trees, know this. If you can paint a tree and paint a tree well, you can take the lessons that you, or the things that you do to make that tree turn out well, and apply it to any other subject. So, stick with me if you say I'm not a tree painter. You don't have to paint a tree, but we are going to focus on some really important concepts this month, and trees are just a vehicle to get us to that destination. So, what I thought I would do for today's video also is to just paint some trees for you, just like I said, to get us into the mood, get us into the spirit. So this is kind of a quick impromptu demonstration. I am working today on a piece of brown Canson paper, that unsanded paper, and I'm working on the smooth side. And you might be wondering, why are you picking brown paper? Well, I selected brown paper because that's what I had. And I usually say that's not a good enough reason for using a piece of paper. It isn't unless you're just going to challenge yourself to use the paper and to find a subject that will fit that paper. So I found a photograph of some trees. I think this was in Florida, and what I liked about them was their really interesting shapes, and I loved the light. It was late afternoon, sun was going down, and it was just really beautiful, warm light. And so I want to play the warm light against the cool backdrop. And so I'm going to play with warm and cool for these tree paintings. So the first thing that I'm going to do is do a very quick drawing. I'm going to just use a kind of orange Nupastels. I can't see that. I want to use something that I can see. I'll go ahead and use a dark blue. So I'm going to put in the horizon, kind of a low horizon. It's not about the foreground. And remember, we did foregrounds last month, so we're shifting gears away from foreground. So we're not going to make this painting about the foreground. There's a bunch of tree shapes in here. Basically, I am just going to be inspired by this particular photo, and I'm not so concerned about painting it exactly the way it is. In fact, there's two dark shapes on either side in this particular photo, two dark, different kind of trees that are not in the light, and they look like bookends. And so I'm not going to put them in the painting because it's not going to lend itself to the composition. I want to indicate where some of those trunks are. We talked about last month overriding what our brain wants to do, which is put things in order and line things up. And our brain is really, really good at lining up trees. And I think you'll know, if you've painted trees before, you know that before you know it, you might have a line of trees and they look exactly the same. That's your brain trying to organize things. So they're not that you want irregular intervals. Intervals are the spacing in between things. So even is boring, so we want them to be irregular and uneven. But I'm gonna have to fight that because I'm sure they'll try to line themselves up. Okay, so we've got our initial drawing. It kind of looks sloppy, but it just shows me where the main shapes are. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do an underpainting with some Nupastels. These are hard pastels because I don't want to fill the tooth of this paper. So I'm going to use hard pastels to begin the painting. And I'm going to use warm and cool. So I've got some oranges and I've got some blues. Orange and blue. A nice complementary color scheme, and also a nice warm and cool scheme, so hopefully this will work out. So the first thing I'm going to do is block in all the dark areas. Now if I squint at my photo, I can see that it's dark behind the sunlit trees, so deep in that mass of trees it's much darker. So I'm going to come in with my dark blue Nupastel, which is just a hard pastel, and paint some of these dark shapes. I'm also going to paint the foreground area dark. You remember from our foreground lesson, a warm, dark foreground is an interesting lead into our painting. My paper happens to have a crease in it, so you can see where I try to go over it. Michael asked me, is that going to be a problem? And I said, no, that's not going to be a problem. But it is something I'm going to have to address. Alright, so we've got all our darks in place. I want to continue along with adding some of these cools. So there's some trees that are behind the orange trees, and I'm going to paint them with a nice turquoisey blue to push them back into the distance. And these will also set off our nice warm sunlit trees as well. I actually pulled out a couple of different turquoises. This is just a little bit different. And why not put it in the foreground? Even though I say warm, we could make it cool. We're going to play the warm and the cool colors. And this month we're not really going to be talking much about color temperature, although I know that's a subject that many of you might want to address. But this is the easiest. Color temperature gets pretty tricky, but we can certainly agree that orange is warm and blue is cool for the most part, and that's going to make it simple for this painting. I don't know if you noticed, but can you see that my tree trunks have gotten themselves lined up? Isn't that amazing how that happens? I'll have to fix that. Now I want to block in the tree shapes, so I'm going to take my darker orange and block in the sunlit trees. Ooh. And you can see I'm going to add some down in the foreground. This color must be very hard because it's not really coming off very easily. The thing with the harder pastels is there's more binder and less pigment, so as a result less pastel comes off. That's good news when you don't want to fill the tooth of your paper, but it's bad news if you're trying to get some pastel down on your paper. It's giving me a little bit of a hard time. I'm going to go ahead and add a very pale sky, just so that I can establish where the sky is. And now I'm going to go in with a peach and reestablish those trunks. Now I can put them wherever I want, and as a matter of fact, what I think I'm going to do is take a piece of my pipe insulation foam, and really any blending tool that you have can work, and I'm going to push this hard pastel into the paper. This gives me a little bit more tooth to work with. I don't want to put my hand in front of that area. Alright, now I can go look at, now you can really see how those got lined up so nicely. Let's go ahead and make this tree a star. So I'm going to add a nice big trunk. And there's one right next to it. And there's one right about here, one right about here. There's another one right about here. There's two together right over here, which are nice. Now if I put one here and I have one here, what's going to happen? They're going to line up again. Now I could make one fatter. Let's maybe make this one fatter. Remember, we want a variety. And if you're like wondering, well, Karen, you're not painting what's in the photograph. And that's true. I'm using the photograph just to give me ideas. If I look carefully in the dark, I can see there's more tree trunks, and we will add those in, but they will not be as warm and light as the main tree trunks. So now the fun part begins. We can start to add the softer pastel, and I'm going to be using my set of Terry Ludwig pastels. This is the floral landscape set, so hopefully you'll see that it's good for more than just floral landscapes. Now, can you remember what is the first thing I do when I'm approaching a painting, no matter what the underpainting or block-in is? Answer that to yourself. And I know some of you are out there saying, oh, you reinforce the darks. And I'm here to say correct. I reinforce the dark areas with softer pastels. So I'm taking a dark blue, similar to the dark blue that I actually began with, the very first one. But this is a softer pastel, so I'm getting a little bit more pigment down. Again, we want to ground these trees. We don't want them floating, so I'm going to add some dark at the base of them. And I'm not one to just layer one layer of dark and call it done. I want it to be a little bit more interesting, so I'm going to add a dark burgundy that just so happens to be the same value as the dark blue. So when I layer them on top of one another, they play nicely together and they create an interesting dark. It's not black, it's not gray. It's got interesting color in there. As a matter of fact, I see some green in there. So I'm going to take a dark, cool green and layer that in the dark areas. Just to give sort of the illusion that there's some green trees back in that distance. And I'm going to throw some of that down in the foreground. You could probably see too that the color of the paper, that brown tone of the paper, is peeking through, and that's great because that is going to help give that illusion of the warm foliage. All right, let's see, where are we at? Before I start in on the lighter areas, I want to take one step further, and I'm going to take my super dark, which is the where did it go? My Terry Ludwig eggplant, which just jumped out of my hand. It got super dirty. And in areas where I really want it to be dark, where I really want you to look, this is what I call an accent color. So right around those focus trees, the trees that are most important, this area right in here, I'm using the darkest dark that I have, which is the Terry Ludwig eggplant. I'm putting in a few tree shapes, grounding those main trunks. I think I'll put a few of that dark right over in this area as well. But if I had started with this, what I call a super dark, imagine if it was everywhere in the painting, then what would happen? It would lose its impact. So when we go with the darkest value that we have right away, what ends up happening is we have nowhere else to go. Like, we have used up our gold. We want to reserve the gold. So be mindful of where you use that. All right, now I am going to take my Workable Fixative. You can really use any Workable Fixative. I'm going to have to find a new one, I think. It's on back order everywhere. And I'm going to lightly fix the painting. Michael, could you grab me a wipe? When you use the eggplant, you get super dirty. And I just like to keep my fingers clean just a little bit. All right, so now the darks are fixed in place by use of the Workable Fixative. So I'm going to go ahead and start adding the foliage masses for the trees. And when I look at them, I see that they're green trees, but because it's late afternoon, the light is warm, it's got an orangey glow to it, then the leaves take on an orangey feeling and they actually look kind of bronze. They don't really even look very green anymore. So before I go into the green, I'm going to start with an orange, a burnt orange. Establish some of the larger masses. Some of this actually go down, some of the foliage on these trees, they're really interesting. They actually go down lower, and there's some right in here that's catching the light. Let's talk for a minute about painting trees. What I like to do when I paint trees is paint the main shapes that I see in the foliage masses in big simple shapes. I do not paint leaves until the very end, and even then I don't paint very many leaves, just a few. I just suggest them. So I start off with masses of foliage. Let's add a little bit more of the orange, and then I gradually add more and more clarity and detail, but only to the trees that I feel are the most important to my painting. Alright, so they're starting to pull together. Now one thing that I can start to do as well is to paint what's behind them. By negatively painting, I start to pull off those foliage masses and define them a little bit more. So I'm taking a dull blue-gray, and in those darker areas that I had established earlier, I'm using it to come in and define those masses that make up the tree shapes. Now I want to be careful at this point while it's still early on in the painting to make sure that my tree shapes are not even. And now when I look at it, I see this is the same, this is the same, this is the same, this is the same. You see this? They're all lined up in a row. Here I am telling you to avoid this, and what happened? I'm actually doing it. So that is how easy it is to do this. It's not really not anything to get yourself aggravated with, because it happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand this tree shape. So I took a little bit more of the dark blue, take a little bit more of that dark orange, and I'm changing the shape of this tree. I'm actually going to bring it up higher as well. So it's going to be taller, because right now, look at, they're all the same height. So this one's going to be taller. I'll probably maybe make this one shorter, just to give a variety. But what I want you to see is it's super easy for this to happen, and we just have to be in control and make those corrections when we see it happening. Alright, so that looks better. I'm going to give it another quick spray of Fixative. Now, here's the thing, when I'm working on Canson on sanded paper, it's so easy to fill the tooth of the paper, and then you don't, what does that mean? It means the pastels start sliding around and you can't get any more layers on it, and it's harder to explain, but once you experience it, you certainly know exactly what it feels like. But occasionally when I am working on sanded paper, I will often spray it from time to time to preserve the darks and to allow more of tooth to develop, or preserve tooth. Now I'm taking a violet, a dull violet, and remember earlier I said there was a few tree trunks that were kind of in the shadows. I'm using the violet to represent some of those tree trunks that are in the shadows. And I think at this point, before I go any further, I'm going to work just a little bit on the foreground. There was one thing that I really liked about the photo, is that there was a really nice sense of light coming in and hitting the grasses. So I think if I just remind myself of putting that in right now, I won't forget. A lot of times I'll do things like this just so that I remember. So I'm putting a nice warm yellowy green in that area. Alright, let's keep working on those tree shapes. Now I'm going to add in some greens, but these are warmer greens. These are yellowy greens. Remember, the sun is hitting the foliage and it looks kind of bronze. Now what I'm going to do is I'm not going to put a lot of detail in the trees that are on the outer bands of the painting. Like on the outer, not outer bands, outer edges. That's the word I really wanted to use. And the reason why is because they are not important. What's important is this area. I want this to be my star, my focal trees. Excuse me. I just want to add just a touch of detail and then reserve the rest of my detail for the main trees themselves. I'm going to have to refine some of these darker areas. Going to give it another quick spray right in here. See how it makes it dark? That's going to help me. Now, one thing that I'm going to do right now before I go any further is put in the sky. So far I haven't put in the sky, and I usually do it a little bit sooner, but in this case I knew that I really wanted it to be a pale, warm color, so I'm putting in a peachy color just to give that glow of the evening sky, or late afternoon sky rather. And I'm using it to carve into the tree shape. So we're going to be talking about sky holes and making sky holes, so I'm not going to really address it in detail here, only to say that I'm going to slow down and I'm going to squint and I'm going to see where those broken areas need to be. And the other thing that I'm going to say about sky holes, and then again we'll address it later on in the month, is very rarely do you get the sky holes right the first pass. So I'll put them in like so, but I'm going to go back and revisit these sky holes later on in the painting. Now I really want to go in and add the light to the tree trunk, so I'm taking another pale peachy color and hitting those trunks with the light. And actually, if I really want them to glow, I need to get a little bit more intense. So I'm going to go in with some orange and hit some of those trunks with some orange. And really give it that feeling of the sunny glow. And again, give some orange to the grass. And you see how the cool and the warm are playing together, and it actually makes the warmer trees feel even warmer than they are. All I really need to do now is refine my focal trees. I'm going to take that orange and I'm going to just keep adding some of that light to where it's hitting the foliage. The other thing that was really interesting in this particular photo that I really liked is that there's some of the trees have some moss hanging off of them. And so I think I'll use kind of a grade green to establish some of that feeling of moss. Let's see. And it may be that I have to revisit my other pastel box to get a few more colors. This set has a lot of great options, and I could probably make do. But a lot of times if I'm painting and I'm next to my box, I'll add to my limited palette when I feel like I need something. Let's just see there. One thing I'm going to do is really pull out the star, and you can do that by reinforcing what's behind it. So I'm going to take that dark and reinforcing the dark area. Now you see how that's really coming alive now, and then reinforcing the bright or lighter area. So I think at this point in the painting process, I would stop, step away, reevaluate. Something told me to throw in some purple, so I did. And I just want to say to you, if the little voice tells you to do something in your painting, do it. And it may or may not work out, but you can always remove it if it doesn't work out. But there's probably a reason why your little voice inside your head told you to do something. Anyways, back to what I was saying, it's probably a good time for me to stop, give it a rest, come back to it with fresh eyes, and of course I'll share the finished painting and any additions that I do to it. But I hope that you're excited as I am about this month's topic, which is trees, and especially focusing on edges. So I'm really excited. If you've got questions about edges, go ahead and ask, and hopefully we'll get it covered this month. And let's have fun and let's paint.